This is Nigel Raine, and he is a professor at the University of Guelph in Ontario. He happens to be in Regina this week for a conference about bees because he is a bee expert and has been leading some really interesting research around pesticides in bees. Tell us what you've discovered, Nigel.
Well, we've been looking at neonicotinoid impacts in bumblebees for quite some time, and the most recent study we've just published has been on the impacts of pesticides on the bumblebee queens themselves. We were looking at two things. We were looking at feeding rates, and we were also looking at ovary development. And we found that across the 4 wild species that we looked at, that the size of eggs in the queens was reduced at the highest level of pesticide that we applied. And so that was a consistent effect. And we think that probably means that those queens are likely to lay their eggs later, which would mean that the colonies will start later. Which could be a problem down the line for the colonies if they're not developing properly, and maybe even affect their ability to produce new queens for the next year. When looking, we also found differences between our species, that some of the species, the queens, actually reduced the amount of nectar they were eating, which is also interesting because we find that there are differences between species given the same level of pesticide exposure.
What happens to us as humans when there's an impact on the population and the queen bees in these bee populations?
Well, wild bees are really important to us for food production. Something like 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food that we eat are dependent on the unmanaged pollination services of bees. So that's wild bees themselves. So that's fruits, vegetables, nut production, that kind of thing. But also supporting the diversity of wild plants we find in wild ecosystems as well, in a variety of habitats. So they're supporting a lot of those different agricultural and wild ecosystems. So we would see quite substantial differences in both farming and the diversity of habitats that we enjoy.
What does this tell us here in Saskatchewan in particular, where pesticide use is so widespread, about what we should be looking at in the future going forward to try and protect all of this?
Well, pollinator health is a multifaceted problem. We need to support them by providing the right type of habitat, the flowers that they need, and the nesting habitat they need, but also think about very carefully with pesticide use about how we match the use of pesticides in terms of their use for controlling pests, but also minimizing the unintended consequences on insects like bees.
And for ordinary citizens, we're out planting our gardens, that kind of thing. Is there anything we can do to help nurture bee health?
Absolutely. We can think about what we're planting in our gardens. So are we planting plants that are friendly to bees, that bees like to get the nectar and pollen? Are we planting so that they're flowering throughout the season? So it's really good to provide flowers now to support the queens in the spring, but also as the colonies develop through to new queen production in the fall. And also thinking about nesting habitats. So gardening in a less structured way, gardening more messily, less yard work is good.
That sounds like a wonderful suggestion. Anything specific to plant that is more helpful?
Well, there are a range of native plants that we can plant, that they're both drought tolerant typically, and also that they attract bees. Plants that are blue and violet typically are really good for bees. They're attractive to bees in general.
Thanks so much for your time today, Nigel.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me on.